Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Who would like to begin with the first question? Yes.
Mr. Branden, in your lecture, Discovering the Unknown Self, you discussed the nature of emotional repression and the tendency of people to intellectualize their emotional problems. In what way, if any, do you think that objectivism has contributed to this tendency, either in the philosophy itself or in its manner of presentation?
Well, to begin with, as I'm sure you appreciate, people have been intellectualizing their problems for many centuries before objectivism was born. And I deal with many clients who are not objectivists and who intellectualize their problems just as skillfully, just as disastrously as the most conscientious student of objectivism. So it would be a great mistake to single out objectivism merely because that's the intellectual circle in which you doubtless move, and to assume that objectivists have a special monopoly or perhaps cornered the market on intellectualizing personal problems. People who are intellectually inclined, people who are philosophically inclined, people who read books, who attend lectures, who move in the sphere of ideas, are perhaps more inclined than others to intellectualize their problems in a way which leaves themselves quite remote from the problems they're discussing. So it's more a phenomenon of intellectually inclined people than of the particular ideology or philosophy to which they subscribe. Turning specifically to objectivism, there might be one or two elements in it which could encourage this particular trend or drift. And one of these factors could be the tremendous importance which objectivism places on conceptualizing. Now, conceptualizing is a very good thing, but it's not a good thing if it consists of a phony kind of conceptualizing ahead of permitting yourself to actually have the experiences which later on you will conceptualize. In other words, conceptualizing isn't a substitute for having experiences or being in contact with one's emotions. And when people attempt to make it a substitute, then it's not authentic conceptualizing, and it's not authentic thinking, for that matter. Further, in objectivism, there is a strong tendency to understand psychological problems too exclusively, perhaps, in terms of mistaken ideas which the individual holds, rather than in learned ways of responding, rather than in automatized or semi-automatized defense mechanisms. And this very heavy emphasis upon the ideas as being central to an explanation of psychological problems also perhaps can tend to generate abstract philosophical discussions in moments or contexts where what is needed is much more honest description of what one is feeling, desiring, fearing, or experiencing, do you see? Now this might lead you to want to ask me, what is my opinion of the role of ideas in psychological problems? And of course, ideas, mistaken ideas, have a great deal to do with psychological problems, but not in the crude, simple sense that by talking a person out of his ideas you will cure his neurosis, because that doesn't happen. And I think by now even the so-called objectivist psychotherapists have discovered that fact. So it's not an issue of philosophical conversion that is required in order to produce psychological change when serious psychological problems are involved, although this does not deny that learning a rational philosophy can certainly be very helpful in freeing an individual of guilt, intellectual confusion, and so forth. But I think that the chief factor, going back to the start of this discussion, lies in the intellectual bent of the many students of objectivism that you probably know. And I think that if you met with intellectuals of other persuasions very different from objectivism, you would encounter very similar observations or phenomena. You know, it's very interesting to me. I've had many occasions in the last few years to meet young intellectuals of intellectual orientations quite different from objectivism. And the personality similarities to objectivism and the troubles they get into and their conflicts and so forth are remarkably similar. There are certain common features of intellectual movements, idealistic groups, philosophical causes, common features that characterize people who are involved in such movements or organizations that are, as I say, remarkably similar. It's very to observe. Yes.
Mr. Branden, have you found some specific techniques to be particularly effective in helping people to become better in touch with their emotions? I am thinking specifically of techniques that can be used when one is alone.
It seems to me that these days I am discovering new techniques almost every week for helping people to become in better touch with their emotions. This is probably one of the most fertile and productive periods of my professional life in terms of the discovery and development of new techniques. Some of these techniques will be presented in a new book which I'm now completing called The Disowned Self, which will be out this fall, hopefully. And in it I will be giving some techniques which an individual could do perhaps at home or with the help of a friend and don't necessarily require the presence of a therapist. It's very important to develop techniques which people can use, even if they first learn them in therapy or from a book, but which later they can apply on their own. These techniques are a little difficult to explain out of context, very, very brief. As you listening to me now or people who will later hear this recording might be quite astonished at the simplicity of some of the things we do in therapy relative to the results that we get. I could give you one example, I almost want to say just for the fun of it, that might astonish you for its simplicity. I was working with a very, very repressed man, quite cut off from his own emotions, quite incapable, so it seemed, of authentically feeling anything, very frozen, very remote, and after many unsuccessful attempts in which I was unable to get him to be in good contact with his emotion, I improvised a technique on the spot one evening in group therapy, which with him was more effective than anything I had ever done, and for the first time he really began to get some sort of breakthrough of repressed feelings. And you may be astonished when I tell you what the technique consisted of. All I asked him to do was to stand up, look at the group, and to say the word "why" as mean as he could, and then to say it again, and then to say it again, and to let whatever happened inside him, if anything happened, to let it happen, to let whatever feeling got generated in him begin to flow. And the whys became more painful, more agonizing, more desperate with each successive repetition. Now, why this particular technique helped him to break through would be too long to get into, but the theory behind it is very simple. When we are blocked, when we are repressed, there are very often particular sentences or thoughts which lie at the very heart of our suffering, sentences that we don't want to say, thoughts we don't want to confront. And sometimes if we can, for a given person, figure out what those key sentences or thoughts might be and encourage the person to say them aloud, why then it can sometimes have the most miraculous effect on beginning the process of helping him to be in touch with his emotions. Now, why is the word "why" so powerful? Well, because for most of us, childhood is not only a very painful period, but a very bewildering period. We don't understand the way adults behave. We don't understand the things they do relative to us. So that I know from observing many of my clients, they are filled with 100 unexpressed whys. Why would you never listen to me when I spoke? Why would you never hold me? Why could I never sit in your lap? Why were you always screaming at Daddy? Why did you always make me feel my best was never good enough? Why did you always make me feel whatever I did was wrong?